Hello, it's just me today, recording in advance as I head off for a funeral. I will be in Connecticut this week, but I will leave you with this week's lessons and two questions from the lessons for extra credit in order, just to give you an incentive to keep just to keep up. Anyway, this week we're talking again about history, and the next thing, we left you at the end of the Dark Ages, and now we go to the Middle Ages. Now, things that happened where we stood at the very beginning of the Middle Ages was, need to get another browser to keep this going.
Meet Janus, the Roman pleb, and John, the medieval peasant. Janus lives in a 4-story apartment building in the sprawling city of Rome. John lives in a thatch hut in one of the hundreds of tiny villages scattered around medieval Europe. Janus went to school. He can read and write. Right now, Janus is using this skill to draw lewd graffiti. But if he so desired, he had access to thousands of pieces of literature from all over the empire at one of Rome's many libraries. John doesn't even know what a school is, let alone a library. He's only ever heard of one book, the Bible, and at any rate, the only person in the village who can read is the priest. Janus starts his day off with a trip to the baths, where he soaks in the hot tubs, and then has a drink of water from a nearby fountain. John hasn't had a bath in months. In fact, he's fairly certain that baths are sinful, though he's not sure why. The closest thing John has to running water is a nearby stream. Janus spends his day off attending one of Rome's many festivals. He catches the first play of an annual theater competition. From there, he heads to the horse races at the Circus Maximus. Tired of the ponies, Janus wanders around the market, where he touches silk from China, tastes olives from Greece, sees paper from Egypt, and smells spices from across 3 continents. Janus finishes his day watching a nice gladiatorial fight at Rome's massive stadium, the Colosseum. John spends his day off attending church. After services, there'll be a market day, oh boy, with peddlers and storytellers and maybe even a maypole. John hopes the peddlers bring some more apples from the village next door, but no such luck. The peddler caravan got waylaid by bandits. No market today. Poor John. How do we explain this disconnect? Janus lived at the height of the Roman Empire, around 100 CE.
And you see the difference. This is the world that people lived in the Middle Ages. Okay, so that's how people lived. If you remember, we had St. Columba and the island of Iona making those Bibles and making things more accessible. One of his teachers, one of those monks, taught Charlemagne and brought Europe to more stability. In 1066, the Normans, which were descendants of Vikings, even though they spoke French, came to England, and English became more of a mix of languages, not just Germanic, but also French. There was paper in Egypt, but the modern paper came from China. Big thing that happened is that in the 11th century, in the late thousands, the Europeans had the Crusades. They sent their people to the Middle East. And what did they find? The Library of Alexandria. They found all that learning, all of that knowledge from the Greeks and the Romans, and they brought it back with them. Yep, gotta use that other browser for this one.
In Europe, the Middle Ages was a time period that spanned from around the 5th century until around the 15th century. This is a time considered between antiquity, think of the ancient Romans and Greeks, and modern periods. The Middle Ages can be divided into 3 separate time periods: the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the late Middle Ages. For this lesson, we will focus on how people learned and were taught during the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages lasted from the 11th century through around the end of the 13th century. During this time period, crop production increased quickly because of some new technology. Agricultural advances led to an increase in the population of Europe. Also during this time, a military campaign pushed Christians to gain control of the Holy Land from the Muslims. Fighting occurred at intervals for years. These holy wars are known as the Crusades. In large part because of the Crusades, the High Middle Ages also experienced a rediscovery of classical knowledge. When using the term classical, we are generally referencing ancient Greece, especially ancient Greek scientists or philosophers like Aristotle. People living in ancient cultures were curious. They wondered about the stars and the human body. They developed mathematical practices. People who lived near the Mediterranean Sea, like the Greeks, studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Essentially, they were studying wisdom. Romans wrote about literature, history, and politics. One of the most important means of preserving and spreading knowledge was the development of paper and books. Text was originally kept on stone tablets, but eventually parchment was developed. Parchment was made from stretched animal skin. Early books made from this material were expensive. In the 8th century, Asians developed a cheaper writing material, paper. Creating paper became popular and spread through Africa and Europe. Books became more accessible and more abundant. Prior to the 11th century, knowledge in Western Europe was somewhat limited. Many books and manuscripts were being preserved by the church.
All right. You have technology started to happen. You have, it's not just the Bible anymore. You bring back all of this stuff from the Middle East. The Arabs had preserved a lot of the ancient knowledge in their libraries. Algebra is an Arab word. So the Crusaders brought back classical knowledge and different ideas. Give me a second here. It should turn on.
This year, keep your redesign resolutions and save up to $1,000 at Haverty's. Because reading more is easy in a chair custom made for you. And working less is simple when your coffee table works for you. Getting more sleep is a dream with the perfect mattress. And spending more time together is effortless when both sides of the sofa recline. So whether you've resolved to play with the kids more, make new friends, or get more organized, with up to $1,000 off and 0% interest, Haverty's makes it easy.
The Crusades were first and foremost an expression of papal authority against the enemies of the church.
The First Crusade was preached by a pope, Pope Urban II, in France in the year 1095. With reference to the Muslims and their advance in Europe and in Jerusalem, I think the Christians in Europe believed that the Islamic message of Muhammad was against and contradictory to what the Christians were saying. They were worried that this idea could possibly overrun the Christian idea.
Pope Urban conceived this idea. It's not a sin if you kill non-Christians, if you kill non-believers in our faith. And so he made this deal that if you go and fight in the Holy Land, you will be forgiven all your past sins. A knight could sin as much as he liked. And simply by going to the Holy Land, he had been given his passport to heaven. And that was an extremely attractive deal. And combined with that, he could win fame, he could win glory, and he could come back with the treasures of the Near East. These are the things that drew knights in their tens of thousands to go on crusade.
When you think about the brutality of the Crusades, you think about what was done to the people that were there, this just flies in the face of what the Christian message is all about.
Remember that these guys embrace the same God, many of the same beliefs, same prophets, and yet the streets ran deep with their blood. It shows the extraordinary power of ideas to take hold of people's minds and drive them to commit acts of great sacrifice and love on the one hand, but also acts of tremendous barbarity and hatred on the other. It's the double-edged sword of religious belief.
The bloodletting of the Crusaders spread throughout the Islamic lands. Everybody heard stories about the massacre of unarmed individuals. It created this intense rage amongst Muslims. In a sense, it resulted in a new kind of Muslim crusade, a desire to raise an army to go back to liberate Jerusalem from the Crusaders as an act of piety on the part of Muslims.
I don't think any of those young men, either Christian or Muslim, could possibly have imagined that their struggle could possibly still be playing itself out 1,000 years later in the area that we call the Middle East today.
But the Crusaders also brought back ideas. And where did those ideas go? Universities.
Using Squarespace helped my business grow from a journal to a website.
During the early Middle Ages, any type of higher education was usually only available in monasteries and cathedral schools, where Christian monks and nuns taught each other and preserved the writings of classical authors. By the 11th century, medieval Europe was becoming more urban and complex, and royal governments needed highly trained men to run their bureaucracies. Students and teachers were also demanding better ways to be educated, and the solution to this came about with the creation of universities. Universities come from the Latin word universitas, which means guild, and these schools were essentially groups of students and teachers who got together into their own groups for the purposes of learning. In some universities, it was the students themselves who paid the teachers and ran the institution. The main curriculum was based on 7 areas: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy, all of which were important for a cleric in the Catholic Church. In some universities, other subjects were also important. That is, Salerno was renowned as a place to study medicine, and Bologna was known for law. By the 12th and 13th centuries, universities were becoming important centers of learning, and some would become quite famous, like Oxford and Cambridge in England, and the University of Paris in France. In the later Middle Ages, universities would emerge in most other parts of Europe too, as monarchs and cities wanted them as sources of highly skilled people.
This is Heloise. She was one of the greatest scholars of Paris in the 1300s. And her great teacher was Abelard. And they obviously got together, and having a woman as a scholar was considered terribly controversial. And they didn't like Abelard and she getting together. So the mob in Paris separated them, mutilated him, and sent them both to convents. But still, new ideas, different from the church.
Bureaucrats.
Like having a woman being a scholar.
To increase their own reputations. Occasionally, though, the relationships between university students and their local communities could get hostile. And since students were treated as clergy, it meant that they could not be tried by local courts for crimes, only in the much more lenient ecclesiastical courts. While very few medieval men and no women could be part of a university, the institution did develop and grow throughout the Middle Ages and became home to some of the period's greatest thinkers, such as Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, I told you, Peter Abelard.
The university has since become the standard of higher education, not just in Europe, but throughout the world. To learn more about medieval education, visit us at www.medievalist.net.
This, like we showed at the very beginning, you had just poor people in villages and all they had was the Bible. The Crusaders brought back all of this knowledge from the Middle East. They gathered in universities, and you start to have different ideas. And some of those ideas were not the same as what the church wanted you to think. Okay, shortly thereafter, you have the plague comes back, and you had the Little Ice Age. Population goes way down. Still, you had things develop. Chaucer, if you read the Canterbury Tales, first modern English novel. Then, similar time, the Turks are moving back to the Middle East, chasing out the last Crusaders, the fall of the last Christian bastion in the eastern part of the world. Constantinople falls. So we're shut out of that new knowledge and the Middle East as of 1453. So where does the new knowledge come from? How do you move forward? The most important thing of the millennium, the printing press. Those different ideas on paper can now be copied and sent out all over Europe. And some of those ideas were not the ideas that the church wanted.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write essays that inspire,
one off, but for most people in the Middle Ages, this was an academic problem. They couldn't read or write anyway. During the Middle Ages, books were written out by hand, mostly in monasteries. Often the monks would spend years on a work. Then, in 1450, an invention changed the world. In the German city of Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg invented the technique of printing with movable type. This made it possible to duplicate books in large numbers and at relatively low cost. The technological foundation was laid for the intellectual, political, and religious changes of the succeeding centuries. Johannes Gensfleisch, who later changed his name to Gutenberg, was born in Mainz in around 1400. His father was a wealthy merchant. Young Johannes attended the monastic school in Mainz. That much we know. But then his child goes cold for a while.
Well, we don't need to know much about his personal life, but
cutting these whole-page blocks is a time-consuming process. First, a mirror image of the handwritten page has to be drawn on the block.
Yeah.
Then the individual letters have to be carved out.
Yeah, they're getting a little better than just handwriting, but wood cutting took time.
Occasionally, a number of pages were bound into a book. The trade in these books also gave a boost to manuscript production. Manuscripts had long since ceased to be the exclusive preserve of the monasteries. Secular scribes were doing good business. The establishment of the first universities had created a great demand for books. Libraries were founded, making knowledge in the form of...
Right, but still it was hard to make books. So Gutenberg comes up with...
These were then combined to form the blocks for printing words, lines, and pages. The characters were cast and could be used in new combinations time and again. A character is produced as follows. On the end of a metal rod, a mirror image of the letter is engraved. This is then pushed into softened copper, producing a pit in the shape of the letter.
Right, and you get these, you get little letters. We call it a letterpress.
The page to be printed.
See? You could just keep resetting those letters.
The form is now inked in with printer's ink. Gutenberg used a mixture of lamp black varnish and egg white. Printing can now start. Gutenberg used a special press for this purpose.
That's why we call it the press. You put the plate with the letters, you ink them up, you put the paper below, and then you take this arm called the printer's devil and press that plate and the ink onto the paper. And that's why we call it today the press.
But he derived the principle from the traditional wine press.
And there you have it.
Gutenberg's first printed works were official documents, papal decrees, and grammars. But soon he started on a mammoth venture, the Latin Bible.
Yep, the Bible. And there are several...
The world's most beautiful printed books. Gutenberg proved that a work print...
And I've seen one in New York City. He printed the Bible.
Spread throughout Europe. 20 years after Gutenberg's invention, the new technology was firmly established. Thousands of titles were marketed in editions of up to 1,000. Books now became affordable for ordinary people. As society grew more literate, the number of potential readers increased. One of Gutenberg's greatest admirers was the reformer Martin Luther. The new art of printing gave him a bright and bold idea. The layman didn't need a priest to tell him what the Bible said. He could read it himself.
This was huge. That there had been many people who rebelled against the church. They were burned at the stake. But since Martin Luther had the printing press, he could print his 95 Theses and say, hey, this is what it really is about. Secondly, if you remember at the beginning of this presentation, you had the guy living in the village who only heard what the priest said. If you have your own Bible, you could say, hey, that's not what the Bible says. So this gives that power of ideas to everybody. And people started questioning the church. They started questioning authority. This is why the printing press is the most important thing that happened. in the Middle Ages.
And decide for himself between revealed truth and the false interpretation put about by the church.
There you go.
So Luther had more than 500,000 copies of his German translation of the Bible printed, a huge number for those days. And to disseminate his Protestant message, he had hundreds of thousands of leaflets distributed. But it wasn't just Luther who exploited the new medium. So did the emperor, along with kings and free cities of the empire. Soon, single-sheet leaflets, flyers we would call them, were discovered as a news medium. When an unusual configuration of planets was announced for 1524, the country faced an avalanche of these flyers, warning of an imminent repeat of Noah's flood. The first daily newspaper appeared in Leipzig in 1650.
Yeah, you would have a flyer announcing something from the king, or you have a printing press that you could print something that someone would come in and say, hey, we have a show, we're selling pigs, we're selling beer, why don't you print up an ad? So, newspapers came out in the 1600s, but before that you had advertising.
Einkommende.
So it's always been a business. One more thing.
It was the end of the Middle Ages, the start of the Renaissance.
Yeah, here's the impact of all of that.
Printing of ideas. The printing press allowed ideas to spread much faster and greatly aided education. In the process, it changed the world. During the Middle Ages, most people could not read. They looked to the church to teach them about religion and how to live life. The printing press began to help people learn to read. Slowly, people became educated beings who could think for themselves. When Martin Luther came to Rome as a priest, he was enraged at the sale of indulgences. The sale of indulgences was the act of the clergy, religious leaders, selling indulgences, places in heaven, to people or the...
You pay the priest and he'd forgive your sins. Not a cool thing. And if you read the Bible, not even mentioned. This is what pissed him off. And and you give the Bible to people and they say, hey, where is that indulgence thing?
He wrote these Flaws of the Catholic Church and many others.
Yep, the 95 Theses. And because there were many, many copies, you could kill Luther, which they didn't do, but his ideas would survive.
The countless battles fought to create other branches of Christianity.
Yep, that's the other side.
Martin Luther was called to attend.
Everybody has their different ideas if you don't have the central church holding together. That's why you have Baptists and Methodists and Episcopalians and Church of Christ, and we still have Catholics, because you have that one Bible, but people look at it differently.
And a trial at the Diet of Worms, a trial for heretics, people who questioned the church. Here he was asked to recant, to take back his
word. But he lived. Other things that happened.
People began to read the Bible for themselves, meaning that they finally weren't just listening to the clergy.
They could think for themselves. Thinking for yourself was a huge thing.
Would have been fiercely outnumbered and massacred. Luther's followers succeeded in a short time to break apart from the Catholic Church, creating the Lutheran Church. By doing this, the Lutherans paved the path for new sects of the church to appear.
What else happened?
As the Renaissance and Reformation progressed, the printing press continued to change the thinking of the European world. As scientists, philosophers, mathematicians, and many other great thinkers of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution began to perform their great and productive lives, they were able to gain great fame and money through publishing their works. By printing their books and writings, the ideas of Marco Polo, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Buonarroti, Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, and many more great thinkers became more influential and changed the thinking of the time. Some of them were able to gain money as their writings sold. Therefore, the printing press introduced a new part of the economy, publishing.
Not only that, it began manufacturing. It is the first item ever mass produced. Before that, everything was handmade. The printing press was the first thing that made copies of things. It's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It is the first thing that was ever manufactured in all mankind, and the first thing that was ever manufactured was ideas.
Marco Polo lived during the early stages of the Renaissance. He became a very famous traveler after he traveled through Asia and China.
You learned about China, Da Vinci and his ideas.
An accomplished architect, sculptor.
And you start learning all of this different stuff. There's Michelangelo.
Copernicus was a multi-talented man of the scientific revolution.
Copernicus, that the earth circles the sun and not vice versa. He was a priest. He waited until he died for his stuff to be published. But that literally rocked the world.
He earned a name for himself as a mathematician. Galilei was yet another multi-talented man of the scientific revolution. Most important was his work as an astronomer. Galileo improved the telescope.
Galileo, who the church didn't like either.
Isaac Newton.
Again, physics, and we learn all about this stuff.
The printing press is still being used today, but its place is being taken by a modern printing press, the internet.
Yep, the spread of ideas. The problem is no one's saying what ideas are good and what's bad. I was hoping that it would mention another thing that happened, 1492, Columbus. Columbus found the New World. Before him, the English were here, the Vikings were here, the Irish were here. But we forgot about them because they didn't write about their exploits. When Columbus found America, it stayed found.
Ideas and news connect.
So, I mean, the printing press was huge. Okay. We will get to more of this in the next time, but the printing press was a big deal. Anyway, we'll start more in the next one, but I appreciate you for looking in, and I'll have some questions on this too. Save, stop share.